Welcome to the Python class again. The last video, in the last video, I solved the exercises I gave to you. I hope you have seen that. And if you haven't, I will encourage you to go over to, I think it should be in the Python solutions and exercises and solutions, or solutions to exercises, or something like that. Today, I'll be wrapping up numbers, and I just want to walk you through a couple of things that we've done. And this is where we started from. We looked at this little program that we call online balance shopping application. It's just a mini thing, right? But these are basic concepts that you should know. So we had item and we wrote input, and all of this I know I've explained very briefly, but I haven't really gone in depth into it. And we'll touch on that very much later. And we accepted all the input here, the item, the price, the payment, and then we calculated the balance here. And if you recall, I did say that there's something wrong with this, and I'll come to that in a moment. And we printed out the output. And I mentioned that this is to help us have a new line. The /n is actually called an escape sequence or escape character. So the escape character is the backslash, and whatever you have there gives you an escape sequence. So this /n just means that print a new line, a blank line. So what it means is that we have two blank lines, and then we have this dash 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 printed, and then we have another blank line. So we also have a print, we have f, and I'll come to all this very much later. And what the reason for this is that we want to print something out that is a value, not a string. We want to print out a value. And the way we tell Python that we have a value within our string of output is by using the f string and the format. This is actually called format. So we format it in such a way that the strings, this is a string for instance, but this is a value. All right, so we've also talked about variables. We've talked about rules for naming variables. We've talked about general conventions. And this is the exercise I was talking about at the beginning of the video. We've also talked about comments, how you should write comments, different ways you can use comments. We've talked about that. And we've also talked about numbers, where we looked at the different kinds of operators. And I also give an exercise here and also a quiz, I believe. So today, I would like to point out some things. And one of the things I did, and let me revert because I don't know if you noticed, but I already renamed this file. And I just want to show you something. I'm going to refactor and I'm going to rename. And I'm going to rename it back to numbers.py. Now, this is wrong and this is bad. In fact, this will make your program have bugs. So this was what I did before, and that's because I just wanted to name it in a way that you could easily reference. However, I'll show you something now. This part of the program isn't okay, and the reason for that is that, and I know you do not understand this yet, but let me just quickly explain again that when you have input, automatically what input gets, the type of input here is always a string. So let me prove that to you. Let me use the terminal just in a moment. So let me say number equals to, I would say, input, enter a number. Okay. Now, as you can see, number equal to input, enter a number. And immediately I run that, it asks me for a number, right? And if I then write that number, I want you to see, of course, I don't expect anything to happen until the next prompt. So, but I'm going to enter 5. 5 is a number, right? I enter 5. Now, you would expect that, and yes, by the way you check the type, that's the data type, the type of data that a variable has, is by using type in Python. So if I do type and I have number, I should see, you would expect to see integer, because 5 is an integer, that's a number, right? But if you do type, you can see string, str. And this is just to prove to you that by default, when you have input like this in Python, it turns out that it defaults to a string data type. And so the way you make it what you want, so say for instance, in this case now, we are casting it to an integer. So if I want it to be a different class, I can say that number equal to int of number. So this number, which is going to be a new variable, is equal to int, that's, I'm casting to an integer now, of the existing number. If I strike the enter button, and then I do type of number, as you can see, this is now an integer. So this is what they call typecasting in programming, generally speaking, where you cast from one data type to another. It also has its own rule, which I'm not going to talk about in this video. I just wanted you to see that, and so that you can understand why we had to include an int here. But what I want to even show you is that this is wrong, because we are dealing with money, right? And when dealing with money, we would always have, it's possible for us to have floating points. And by floating points, I mean decimals. By decimals, think of it in monetary terms. I mean cents, for instance. If it's in dollars, you have cents, right? And if it's in naira, you have kobo. I don't know who still spends that anyways. Yeah, but you have those, especially when you're doing online shopping. So the way to do this, and you would think, apart from using an integer, which we don't want to use because this would default to a whole number, and so there's no way we would get an accurate change. So say for instance, let me run this program, and we say what item did the customer buy. We say shoe, and let's say that the item costs 34.9 and the customer paid 50. You would expect, and as you can even see, we have a problem. It says that this is an invalid literal for int, and that's because you can't even cast from the from float to int as it is in this case, because as you can see, the problem we actually have is the fact that the price of the item was 34.90, and that's the problem. So let's head over to this place and let's see if we can actually do this. Int of 34.90, we get 34, right? And so we actually expect to get something here. So what happened? Let's see again. We try to run this. What item did the customer buy? Shoe. How much is the item? And that's the price. And let's say 34.90. And how much did the customer pay? And let's say 50. And if we do this, we get this error. And what does the error tell us? It says that balance equal to int payment minus int price, value error, invalid literal for int with base 10, 34.90. And that's why I said this is wrong. So for money, for monetary values, it's much advisable to use decimal. I know we've not talked about decimal, and perhaps you've seen float, and maybe you would even see float, because float allows us to use decimal places. But there's a problem with float. Now, if I try to run this application now, I believe it should work. So shoe 34.90 and let's say 50. And as you can see, we have this. And it says, please give the customer a balance of 15.1000. And while that might look like, oh, what's the meaning of that? We can also come here and say that balance, we want to round the balance to a decimal place of 2. So I can just do something like this, comma 2. And that will round it up to a 2 decimal place. So if I try to run this again, what item? Shoe 34.90. The customer paid 50. And as you can see this time around, you can see even though I rounded it up to 2 decimal places, but see the output. Now, I want you to notice something, because I would then use decimal rather, so that you'll see how decimal operates. But for you to use decimal, you need to import it from this decimal package, which is from the decimal module. And that's from decimal, import decimal. And so to use that decimal now, it's about the same thing. Just come here and we do decimal. And here as well, we do decimal. I don't need this part any longer. And I misspelled decimal. So let's try to run this and let's see an error. Now, we can't even run this. What's the problem? It says attribute error, module, numbers has no attribute number. And so what I wanted to point out to you was this. When we named this file as numbers, it turns out that in Python, there's actually a module called numbers. And when I named this file as numbers, it overwrote whatever was in Python. And so the way to solve this, and which of course I also wanted to talk about, is that when you are naming your Python file, make sure that you're naming those files in a way that it doesn't conflict with what exists in Python. So if, for instance, I name this file, I'm going to refactor now, and I rename. So if I rename this to decimal, I will have a problem. You won't see the problem. You won't see the issue, right? But this will not work fine, because now it's more like, or even I think that would be the lowercase d. Refactor, rename the lowercase d. And as you can see, immediately I did that. Look at this. This is already yelling at me that there's nothing like decimal, cannot find reference decimal in decimal.py. And that's because in Python, there's decimal module. And so I have just overridden what exists in Python. So let me revert and let me just rename this. I'm going to rename this to number, let's say my number. And immediately I do that, look at this place here. Okay, so, and again, you can see just because I refactored and then I asked it to change everything everywhere. So it did this. I'll just get back again to decimal and we're good to go. So I just felt I needed to also mention this because at times when you are writing programs, you need to be sure of what you named your files and be sure that it doesn't conflict with anything that exists in Python. And so back to decimal and float and int war, which it's not a war really, because int is just not part of this whole thing. Let's see now. Now that we have decimal, let's see how this program behaves. If I try to run this, it says what item did the customer buy? What item did the customer buy here? How much is the item? 34.90. And how much did the customer pay? 50. And I want you to take a look at this now. Can you see the output? The output is now 15.10, which makes more sense. Because in the previous one, where we used float, if we use float, and I'm going to run this again. What item did the customer buy? Shoe, 34.90. And how much did the customer pay? 50. Now, in all, okay, I think I rounded it up to 2 decimal places. So let me just do that again. I'm going to rerun. Shoe, how much? 34.90. How much does customer pay? 50. And I want you to take a look at this again. You can see, I mean, if you're like me, I don't know, I would have given this person $15.01. And that's not his accurate change. That's not his accurate balance. Because $15.01 is not his balance. If you are to read this without thinking of the 01, yeah. So the best bet you have when working with numbers that have to do with money is to use decimal. And I think now you know. So we run this again. How much? Shoe. How much is the item? 34.90. What is it? This. And if you look at the program, we now have 15.10. And this is explicit. I mean, you can easily give the person change the balance. All right, so I think that's what I wanted to cover in this video. Just a little bit of things that one might just overlook that you may not really take cognizance of, or maybe, yeah. So see you in the next one. We'll dive now into texts, which is a little bit more complex, but not overly complex. I'll try to demystify the whole thing as much as possible. So see you in the next one. Have a good time. Bye-bye.